The conference room on station held representatives from 247 different species. Doctor stood at the center podium, her four arms gesturing at the massive holographic display that floated above the assembled crowd. The numbers glowed in soft blue light, scrolling through data that had taken her research team 5 years to compile. The Galactic Grief Index is now complete, she announced, her translator chip converting her clicking speech into something everyone could understand. We have documented how every known spacefaring civilization processes death and loss. The audience listened quietly. Most of them had contributed data to the project. They had shared their protocols, their psychological frameworks, their efficiency ratings. Doctor felt proud of the work. It was thorough. It was scientific. It was comprehensive. As you can see, she continued, there is remarkable consistency across species. The average 2.3 standard days of grief processing before returning to normal productivity. They update their collective memory banks and resume function within 1.8 days. They utilize chemical with a 94% success rate in eliminating prolonged sorrow. The Pelian system of cognitive restructuring shows similar efficiency. Ambassador Maria sat in the back row, her resting untouched on her lap. She watched the presentation with a growing sense of unease. The numbers were accurate. The data was clean, but something felt deeply wrong about all of it. Her mother had died 2 months ago. Maria had taken the standard 3 days of bereavement leave, attended the brief memorial service and returned to her duties on station. Her siblings had handled the estate matters efficiently. The grief counselor had given her a clean psychological assessment after the mandatory 2 sessions. Everything had been processed correctly. But at night, alone in her quarters, Maria still cried. She still reached for her communication device to call her mother before remembering she was gone. She still felt a hollow ache in her chest that the counselor had assured her would fade with proper cognitive restructuring. The data shows us that intelligent species have evolved past primitive emotional responses to death, Doctor was saying. We no longer require extended periods of dysfunction. We process, we adapt, we continue. This is progress. Maria's hands tightened on her. The presentation continued for another hour. Species after species showed the same pattern: quick acceptance, efficient processing, rapid return to productivity. The graphs all looked similar. The outcomes were nearly identical. Death happened, protocols engaged, life resumed. When Doctor opened the floor for discussion, a delegate spoke first. This confirms what we have always known. Prolonged grief serves no evolutionary purpose. The dead cannot benefit from our distress. Efficiency is compassion. Several other delegates murmured agreement. A representative added, "Our species eliminated extended mourning practices 700 cycles ago. Mental health improved. Productivity increased. It was clearly the correct decision." Maria felt something snap inside her chest. She raised her hand. Dr. Sensory Stalk swiveled toward her. "Yes, Ambassador." Maria stood slowly. Her heart was pounding. My species has a saying, grief is love with nowhere to go. The room went quiet. Several delegates turned to look at her. We don't mourn because it's efficient, Maria continued, her voice stronger now. We mourn because the alternative is forgetting how much someone mattered. We mourn because love doesn't end when breathing stops. Doctor tilted her head, a gesture of confusion among her people. But surely, Ambassador, humanity has also adopted modern protocols. The index shows that Earth's integration into galactic society included comprehensive psychological modernization programs. We were told our old ways were primitive, Maria said. The words were coming faster now, years of suppressed feelings rising to the surface. We were told that week-long wakes were unproductive, that building monuments to individual dead was a waste of resources, that our funeral rites were excessive and unhealthy. We believed you. We changed. She looked around the room at all the alien faces watching her. But my mother died 2 months ago, and I followed all the protocols. I did everything right, and I still feel like there's a hole in my chest that gets bigger every day. The counselor says I'm experiencing abnormal grief extension, but maybe the problem isn't that I'm grieving wrong. Maybe the problem is that the protocols don't actually work. Dr. Sensory stalks drooped, a sign of discomfort. You had week-long ceremonies for single individuals. Sometimes longer, Maria replied. Some cultures wore black for a year. Others returned to gravesites annually for decades. We wrote songs about our dead. We told stories. We created entire holidays dedicated to remembering them. We made grief into art, into ritual, into something sacred. Her eyes were wet now. And then we stopped because the galaxy told us we were doing it wrong. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then slowly, a young Pelian researcher near the front raised one of his appendages. His voice was hesitant. I must confess something. My broodmate died 6 months ago. I completed all the standard protocols. I passed all the psychological assessments, but I still think about her every day. I still feel pain. I thought there was something defective in my neural structure. I was considering requesting remedial therapy. A delegate stirred in her seat. I refused the chemical when my parent died. I told no one, but I couldn't accept that I was supposed to just stop feeling anything. It seemed wrong somehow, disrespectful. I restored my deceased partner's memory files, admitted quietly. It's against our protocols. I could be sanctioned, but I couldn't bear to delete her. Remembering hurts, but forgetting hurt worse. One by one, others began to speak. Across species, across cultures, the same confession emerged. The protocols didn't work. They suppressed grief, but they didn't transform it. They silenced pain, but they didn't create healing. And underneath all the efficiency and productivity metrics, there was a galaxy full of beings who felt broken because they couldn't stop loving the dead. Doctor looked at Maria with something that might have been hope. Ambassador, would you be willing to describe these human ceremonies in detail for research purposes? Maria nodded slowly. I can do better than that. I can show you, but I have to warn you it won't be neat. It won't be quick. It won't look like progress. She paused. It will look like people who love each other finding ways to say goodbye when goodbye takes time. How much time? Doctor asked. However long it takes, Maria said. That's the point. 3 weeks later, Doctor arrived on Earth with a research delegation of 26 beings from 15 different species. They came with monitoring equipment and psychological scanners and detailed observation protocols. They came as scientists, skeptical and careful. Maria met them at the spaceport in Louisiana. She had spent the weeks preparing, reaching out to cultural preservation groups, anthropologists, and families who had maintained old traditions despite social pressure to modernize. What she had discovered astonished her. Humans hadn't just had one way of mourning, they had thousands. Before we joined Galactic Society, Maria explained as they traveled toward New Orleans, every human culture had developed their own technologies of grief. Not technologies in the sense of machines, but in the sense of carefully designed practices that help people navigate loss. The young Pelian researcher looked out the transport window at the passing city. Why did you abandon them? Because we wanted to be modern, Maria said quietly. Because we were embarrassed by how emotional we were compared to other species. Because we thought efficiency was the same as evolution. She turned to look at him. We were wrong. The first ceremony Maria showed them was a jazz funeral. The tradition had survived in New Orleans, kept alive by families who valued continuity more than conformity. They watched as musicians gathered outside a small house, instruments in hand. A casket was carried out slowly, and the procession began. The music was mournful at first, slow and heavy with sorrow. The mourners walked behind the casket, their faces streaked with tears. The melody seemed to carry the weight of loss, making it visible, making it shared. The delegate recorded everything with her multiple visual sensors, but Maria could see her trembling slightly. They processed through streets lined with people who stopped what they were doing to watch. Some joined the procession. Others stood with hands over hearts. The community witnessed the grief, validated it, held space for it. Then at the cemetery, after the burial was complete, something changed. The music shifted. The tempo increased. The mood transformed from sorrow to something else, something complex. The musicians began to play upbeat melodies, and the mourners began to dance. Looked confused. Why are they celebrating? The death just occurred. They're not celebrating the death, Maria explained. They're celebrating the life. This is called the second line. It's about holding both things at once, the sorrow of loss and the joy of having known someone worth mourning. Death and life aren't opposites in this tradition. They're partners. As the music swelled, began to cry. His species didn't produce tears the way humans did, but the emotional release was unmistakable. I didn't know, he said, his voice breaking through his translator. I didn't know that grief was allowed to move. I thought it could only sit heavy and still, crushing you. Doctor moved closer to him, a gesture of comfort. Neither did I, she said softly. They watched the second line wind through the streets, a moving celebration of memory and loss and love. The community danced together, some laughing, some crying, most doing both. An elderly woman grabbed Maria's hand and pulled her into the procession. Maria found herself moving with the music, her own suppressed grief beginning to crack open inside her chest. This was nothing like the efficient memorial service she had attended for her mother. This was messy and loud and long. This took time and energy and resources. This was completely, gloriously impractical. And Maria finally understood what had been missing. Her mother deserved more than 3 days and she deserved this. She deserved music and tears and laughter. She deserved to be mourned in a way that matched how much she had mattered. When the ceremony finally ended hours later, the delegation gathered in a quiet courtyard. Nobody spoke for a while. Finally broke the silence. The physical movement, the communal participation, the extended duration, these aren't primitive practices. They're sophisticated technologies. They give grief somewhere to go, something to do. They transform overwhelming emotion into structured experience. And the community witnesses it, Doctor added, her sensory stalks quivering with excitement. The sorrow is shared. No one carries it alone. That's what we lost in our modern protocols, the understanding that grief is not an individual problem to solve but a collective passage to navigate together. Maria looked at these alien researchers, these beings from across the galaxy who had come to Earth seeking answers. This is just one tradition, she said. There are hundreds more. Each culture found their own way through grief. Each one built different maps through the darkness. Show us, Doctor said, show us all of them. And so Maria did. Over the next several weeks, the delegation traveled across Earth. In Japan, they participated in a Buddhist memorial service marking the 49th day after death. The family had gathered at a temple, bringing offerings and sharing memories while incense smoke carried prayers upward. The ritual's precise structure provided a container for emotion that might otherwise overwhelm. A named watched as the family took turns speaking about their grandmother. Each story added another layer to the portrait of who she had been. This is what we lost, said quietly. We delete our memory files of the dead, thinking it reduces pain. But we're not reducing pain. We're erasing people twice. In Ghana, they witnessed the creation of a fantasy coffin for a recently deceased human pilot. The coffin was shaped like a small spacecraft, painted with stars and planets. The artist explained his philosophy as he worked. We don't just mark that someone died, we celebrate how they lived. The coffin says, "This is who you were and we saw you and you mattered." The family laughed and cried as they viewed the finished coffin. They told stories about their father's love of flying, his terrible jokes, the way he sang off-key. They held both grief and joy simultaneously, letting the emotions exist together without trying to eliminate either one. Doctor recorded every moment. In our rush to be efficient, we made grief into a problem that needed solving. But humans understood something we forgot: grief isn't a problem. It's a testament. It's love persisting past death. In Ireland, they attended a traditional wake. The body lay in an open casket in the family home while friends and relatives gathered for 3 days. They ate together, drank together, told stories late into the night. Some stories were sad, some were funny, all of them were true. Sat with the family through one long night, listening to them talk about the deceased grandfather. Around midnight, someone told a story about a disastrous fishing trip that had the whole room laughing. Then someone else began to cry and others joined in. Then the laughter started again, mixed with tears. "How do you hold both at once?" asked the grandson sitting beside him. "The laughter and the crying." The young man thought about it. "Because Grandpa was both, I guess. He was the funniest person I knew and also someone I loved so much that losing him breaks my heart. If I only cry, I'm not remembering all of him. If I only laugh, I'm pretending it doesn't hurt. You gotta hold both." Nodded slowly. In Pelian culture, emotions were supposed to be isolated, processed individually, and eliminated systematically. But watching this family move fluidly between joy and sorrow, he realized his species hadn't evolved past complex emotions. They had simply amputated them. The most profound experience came in Mexico City during Lowe's. The delegation walked through cemetery at night, where thousands of candles illuminated graves covered in marigold flowers. Families had created elaborate altars on the burial sites, decorated with photographs, favorite foods, drinks, and personal items belonging to the deceased. An elderly woman named Mendoza knelt beside an altar she had built for her husband. His photograph smiled from the center, surrounded by candles, orange marigolds, a bottle of tequila, his favorite cigars, and sweet bread made specifically for the holiday. Maria approached her carefully. "Mendoza, this is Doctor and her colleagues. They're studying how humans mourn. Would you be willing to talk with them?" Looked up at the assembled aliens with curiosity but no fear. "Of course. What do you want to know?" Knelt beside the altar, his species gesture of respect. "If I may ask, your husband died many years ago." 43 years, said. "Next month would have been our 50th wedding anniversary." "But you still remember him. You haven't completed the grief process." Smiled a sad but genuine expression. "Oh, I've grieved him, honey. I've cried more tears than the ocean holds, but that doesn't mean I stop remembering. That doesn't mean he stops mattering." She gestured at the altar. "I come every year. I bring his favorite things. I talk to him. I tell him about his great. I let him know he's still part of our family." "But he's gone," said, struggling to understand. "The pain of remembering is the price of love," finished gently. "You think grief is the problem, but it's not. Grief is just love that has nowhere to go, so we make places for it." She touched the photograph tenderly. "This altar isn't about pain, it's about connection. It's about saying that death doesn't end relationships, it just changes them." Doctor's translator struggled to convey the emotion in her voice when she spoke. "In my culture, we delete memory files of the deceased after the standard 3 cycles. We're told it's healthier to move forward without the weight of loss." "But then don't you lose them twice?" asked. "Once when they die and again when you forget?" The question hung in the air like the incense smoke drifting through the cemetery. Around them, other families tended their altars, played music, shared food with both the living and the dead. Children ran between the graves, laughing. Elders wept quietly. Everyone participated in this ancient dance between memory and loss. Looked at its altar, at the care and time invested in it, at the love radiating from every carefully placed object. "How long does proper grieving take?" he asked. Considered the question. "As long as you need. For some things maybe just a few months. For my husband," she shrugged. "I'll be grieving him until I join him, but that's okay. The grief has changed over time. It's not the sharp, cutting pain it was at first. Now it's more like a warm ache, like a scar that reminds me something important happened here. That doesn't sound efficient, Doctor observed, but her tone wasn't critical. It's not, agreed, but love isn't efficient either. Why should grief be? That night requested something unprecedented from his home world, special dispensation to restore his deceased broodmate's memory files. It took 3 days to get approval, and even then it came with the requirement that he submit to psychological monitoring. But when the files were restored, spent hours reviewing them, not as therapy, not as processing, as remembrance, as memorial, as love. Doctor compiled her observations into a preliminary report. Her conclusions were radical enough that several colleagues warned her against publication, but she sent it to the Interstellar Psychological Archives anyway. The Galactic Grief Index has documented how spacefaring species process death, she wrote. But processing is not the same as healing. Efficiency is not the same as wellness. Humanity did not invent grief. That is universal to all sentient life. But humans invented something the rest of the galaxy has forgotten, meaning-making around grief. They created technologies of sorrow that transform loss into legacy, that convert pain into remembrance, that understand death not as a problem requiring solution, but as a passage requiring navigation. They knew that the dead deserve our time, our tears, our attention. They knew that how we mourn reveals how we loved. And they knew that grief, properly tended, doesn't diminish with time, it transforms. The report concluded, the galaxy's modern protocols don't process death efficiently, they suppress it, and suppression is not healing. Perhaps it is time to learn from what we once called primitive. When the report was published, the reaction was immediate and divided. Efficiency councils denounced it. Pharmaceutical companies that manufactured emotional to have it retracted. Several planetary governments banned its distribution. But individuals began reading it anyway, passing it through private channels and secure networks. And slowly, quietly, they began asking themselves dangerous questions. What did our ancestors do? What did we lose? Can we find our way back? And most importantly, have we been grieving wrong, or have we simply been told that grief itself is wrong? The galaxy stood at a threshold, uncertain whether to step forward or back. But in the darkness of that uncertainty, something small and fragile had begun to grow. It looked a lot like hope. The resistance to Doctor's report came swiftly and from multiple directions. The Efficiency Council published a counterpaper within a week, arguing that embracing extended grief periods would result in a 17% decrease in productivity metrics. The Medical Collective issued a statement warning that reviving archaic emotional practices could destabilize their carefully balanced collective consciousness. Pharmaceutical companies distributed their own research showing that chemical had a 94% success rate in managing grief symptoms. On her home world of, Doctor was called before the Academic Standards Board. They met in a formal chamber, 12 senior researchers arranged in a semicircle, their sensory stalks rigid with disapproval. Your report contradicts 200 years of psychological progress, the head of the board stated. You're advocating for regression to primitive emotional states. This is dangerous, Doctor. People are taking your conclusions seriously. Perhaps they should, replied calmly. Our progress has left billions of beings unable to process the most fundamental experience of sentient existence. You have no empirical evidence that these human practices produce better outcomes. I have, said a young researcher who was contemplating suicide because he thought he was defective for still missing his broodmate. He participated in human mourning rituals. He restored her memory files. And for the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than crushing emptiness. If that's not a better outcome, I don't know what is. The board was unmoved. They gave her a choice: retract the report or face professional termination. Chose termination. On Earth, Maria received the news through a coded message. She sat in her quarters aboard station, staring at the communication screen, feeling anger build in her chest. Had risked everything to tell the truth, and the galaxy's response was to silence her. Maria made a decision. If they wanted to suppress the research, fine, but they couldn't suppress actual experience. They couldn't erase ceremonies that had existed for thousands of years. They couldn't delete the memories of people who had learned there was another way to grieve. She sent out a carefully worded message to cultural preservation groups, anthropological societies, and grief support networks across Earth. We're hosting a symposium. 7 days. All traditional mourning practices welcome. Anyone from any species can attend. We're going to show the galaxy what remembrance actually looks like. She called it the Great Remembrance. 3 months later, over 10,000 beings gathered in neutral territories across Earth. They came from 214 different species. Some came officially, sent by curious governments or research institutions. Most came secretly, taking personal leave, lying to supervisors, risking social censure. They came because they were tired of pretending grief could be processed like data. They came because they still hurt, and the protocols had failed them. The delegation performed their ancient severance dances in a clearing outside Geneva. These complex physical movements had once helped their hive minds process individual losses without destabilizing the collective. They had been banned 800 cycles ago as psychologically dangerous. Maria watched as 12 moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies creating patterns that seemed to make grief visible. The movement was beautiful and heartbreaking, a physical language for speaking the unspeakable. When they finished, several of them were trembling with emotion they'd been taught to suppress. An elderly named Kay approached Maria afterward, moving slowly on aged limbs. I performed this dance for my offspring 60 years ago in secret in my dwelling unit. I was young then. My offspring had died in an accident, and the collective had already erased her from our shared memory banks. But I couldn't let her go. So I danced alone, hiding from my own people, convinced I was defective. Tears rolled down the sides of his face, a sight Maria had never seen from her. Today I danced with others. Today I wasn't defective. Today I was just a father who loved his daughter. They held their circle of speaking in a converted amphitheater. 300 sat in concentric circles around a central space, where a hologram displayed the image of an elder named Ara who had died 4 months prior. One by one, every in the circle stood and shared a single memory of her. The process took 11 hours. There were no time limits, no efficiency requirements. One spoke for 2 minutes about how Ara had taught her mathematics. Another spoke for 20 minutes about a conversation they'd had about the nature of consciousness. A child spoke for 30 seconds about how Ara had made the best fruit pastries. Maria sat in the outer circle, listening to the memories accumulate, layer upon layer, building a monument made of words. They didn't interrupt each other. They didn't hurry. They gave Ara's life the time it deserved. When the last had spoken, they sat in silence for a long moment. Then they began to hum, a resonant sound that came from deep in their thoraxes. The hum built and built, 300 voices creating a harmonics that vibrated through the amphitheater. It was their old way of saying goodbye, not with words but with shared sound, with vibration that connected every body in the circle. A young named Lee found Maria afterward. We were told the circle of speaking was eliminated because it took too long, that it prevented proper closure. But it doesn't prevent closure. It creates it. How can you close a door properly if you won't even look at what's behind it? The dirge operas were performed in an old concert hall in Vienna. These complex musical compositions required every member of the deceased's community to participate, each voice carrying a part of the grief melody. The practice had been abandoned because unified emotional expression was deemed socially regressive. Maria listened as 200 voices wove together in intricate harmonies, singing the life and death of an engineer named who had died in a construction accident. The music was devastating in its beauty, turning sorrow into something transcendent. They didn't use words, just tones and harmonics that bypassed language and spoke directly to emotion. When it ended, Maria found herself weeping. She hadn't known, she'd never met a before this week. But the music had communicated something universal, that loss mattered, that grief deserved beauty, that the dead should be honored with the best art the living could create. Humans taught their varied traditions to anyone interested. Jazz funerals wound through temporary settlements. Buddhist memorial services were held in makeshift temples. Altars appeared overnight, decorated with marigolds and photographs and favorite objects. Story circles lasted until dawn. Trees were planted in memory of the dead, each one a living monument. The galaxy's species mixed and learned from each other. A learned to build a Lowe's altar for her deceased sister. A participated in an Irish wake and discovered that laughter and tears could coexist. A joined a jazz funeral's second line and felt grief transform into something that moved instead of crushing. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. A ship arrived from VII, a mining world in the outer rim. The delegation leader, a geologist named, requested an urgent meeting with Maria. They met in a quiet garden where a memorial service had recently concluded. Its crystalline structure showed stress fractures, a sign of extreme emotional distress in her species. 6 months ago, there was a disaster in our primary mine, said, her voice modulated through a translation device. A catastrophic collapse, 17,000 dead in an instant. It was the worst disaster in our planet's history. Maria's breath caught. I'm so sorry. We followed all the proper protocols, continued, her structure flickering with light patterns that indicated anguish. 3-day grief cycles, mandatory counseling, chemical for everyone who requested them, productivity monitoring to ensure healthy recovery. Within 2 weeks, life returned to normal. The numbers said we had processed it correctly. But we're dying, said simply. Not physically, internally. Our planet feels hollow. People move through their days like automatons. Suicide rates have increased 400%. Chemical usage has skyrocketed. Our children no longer play. We did everything right according to the modern protocols, and it's destroying us. She looked at Maria with eyes that glowed with desperation. We read Doctor's report. We saw the footage from the Great Remembrance. We need to know if there's another way. If there's a way to make it stop hurting, or if not that, then a way to make the hurt mean something. Maria felt the weight of that question. 17,000 dead, an entire planet suppressing collective trauma. I can't promise it will stop hurting, but I can show you how to transform the hurt into something other than emptiness. The Great Remembrance was extended another 7 days specifically for the human grief counselors worked alongside to recover mourning traditions that had existed before galactic contact. They found records of ancient practices that had been abandoned centuries ago as primitive. They had once held a ceremony of stones. When someone died, every person who had known them would bring a stone and place it in a cairn. The process could take weeks for beloved individuals, resulting in monuments that reached impressive heights. The practice had been eliminated as inefficient and resource-intensive. Maria helped organize a ceremony of stones for the 17,000 who had died in the mining disaster. They chose a hillside overlooking the settlement. For 7 days, lined up to place stones. Some brought small pebbles. Others brought boulders they could barely carry. Many brought 17 stones, one for each 1,000 lost, unable to name individuals but needing to mark the magnitude of loss. Human traditions were woven in. A jazz band played as the stones were laid. Story circles gathered in the evenings where people shared memories. Buddhist monks led meditation services for those who wanted them. Lowe's altars appeared, decorated with photographs of the dead and offerings of minerals native to VII. They wept openly as they worked. They screamed. They sat in silence. They held each other. They did all the messy, inefficient, utterly necessary things that the modern protocols had taught them to suppress. Spent 3 days at the growing cairn. She brought stones for 27 colleagues and friends who had died in the collapse. For each one, she spoke their name aloud and shared a memory. Her structure fractured further as she grieved, but somehow she seemed less fragile than when she'd arrived. On the 7th day, when the last stone was placed, the cairn stretched 50 meters into the sky. 17,000 stones, each one a life, each one placed with intention and love. They gathered around it in the evening light. Maria stood with them, humbled by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Beside her, and Doctor watched in silence. Across the gathered crowd, beings from hundreds of species stood together, united by the understanding that grief was universal and that meaning could be made from loss. Approached the base of the cairn. Her voice, amplified so everyone could hear, rang out across the hillside. We were told that extended mourning was primitive, that efficiency was progress, that moving on quickly was strength. We were wrong. She touched one of the stones with a crystalline appendage. 17,000 lives deserve more than 3 days and a psychological assessment. They deserve this. They deserve our time. They deserve to be remembered properly. They began to hum, a vibrational sound that resonated through their crystalline structures and through the stones of the cairn itself. The sound built and built, thousands of voices creating harmonics that made the very air seem to glow. It was their ancient way of saying goodbye, recovered from historical records and performed for the first time in centuries. Maria felt the vibration in her bones. She thought about her mother, who deserved a proper goodbye. She thought about every person across the galaxy who had been told their grief was too much, too long, too inefficient. She thought about the thousands of ceremonies happening simultaneously across Earth, each one a small rebellion against the tyranny of efficiency. The images from the Great Remembrance spread across the galaxy through personal networks and social platforms. The official media ignored it or published dismissive articles about regression and emotional indulgence. But individuals watched the footage of the cairn, of the severance dances, of the dirge operas, and they felt something crack open inside themselves. Comments appeared on underground forums. I thought I was broken because I still missed my parent after 6 months. The protocols said I was recovered, but I still felt hollow. I deleted my partner's memory files like I was supposed to, and I've regretted it every day since. Why did we think efficiency was more important than meaning? Uploaded his personal story, how he'd contemplated suicide rather than admit he couldn't stop grieving, how human ceremonies had saved his life, how he'd restored his broodmate's memory files and finally found peace. The post went viral. Within a week, over 1 million beings had shared their own stories of suppressed grief, of following protocols that didn't work, of pretending to be fine while dying inside. The Galactic Grief Index was officially updated 6 months after the Great Remembrance. Doctor, now working independently after her termination, submitted a massive supplement to the original research. She titled it, "On the Difference Between Processing Death and Honoring the Dead." Her new conclusion was uncompromising. Efficiency is not synonymous with healing. The galaxy's modern protocols don't process grief, they suppress it. They prioritize productivity over conformity over authenticity. Humans did not invent grief, but they pioneered the radical concept that loss should be marked, not merely managed. That the dead deserve our time. That love persists beyond death, and grief is its testament. In our rush to modernize, the galaxy discarded of wisdom. It is time we learned from what we arrogantly called primitive. The updated index included detailed documentation of over 300 traditional mourning practices from across the galaxy, most recovered from historical archives where they'd been forgotten. It included psychological data showing that participants in traditional ceremonies reported higher long-term scores than those who followed modern protocols. It included testimonials from thousands of beings who had